Welcome students. In today's lecture we are going to continue our poem Kubla Khan written by S.T. Coleridge. In our previous lecture we have read that Kubla Khan orders to make a pleasure dome for himself in Xanadu, and poet also tells us about the 10 miles fertile area on which this palace was to be built. He also tells us that there were gardens, bright gardens, and sacred river Elf that was flowing through the measureless caves. And there were old forests also, green hills, and a mysterious chasm. And there is a mighty fountain also, and this fountain was making continuous roaring sound. Now let us continue our poem. Amid whose swift, half-intermitted burst, huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail, or chaffy grain beneath the thresher's flail. So, this mighty fountain was not outbursting continuously, although it was making sound continuously, but it was bursting out at a regular interval. Okay. So, in the middle of these regular intervals, huge fragments, huge means big, fragments means pieces. So, in the middle of these regular intervals, big pieces of rocks were jumping out. Vaulted means jumped. They were jumping out in the middle of these regular intervals. So, huge fragments of rocks were also bursting out from this fountain at regular intervals. And then poet compares this process of jumping rocks with two different images. In the first image, poet compares this with rebounding hail. Hail means ole, okay? He compares it with hails in the storm, which hit the ground and then goes into different directions. So first he compares these rocks with hails, as you can see right now on your screen. Then in the second image he compares these rocks with the image of a thresher who is using a flail to separate grains from its chaff. Chaff means bhusa and grain means anaj. Okay, you can see on the screen that a farmer is using a flail to separate chaff from its grains. Okay, so he compares these rocks with the image of a thresher who is using a flail to separate grains from its chaff, because when thresher hits the grains with flail, the grains jump into the air. So poet in the second image, he is comparing these rocks with jumping grains under a flail. And amid these dancing rocks, at once and ever, it flung up momentarily the sacred river. So in poet says that this mighty fountain was bursting at regular intervals, and in the middle of these intervals huge fragments of rocks are also bursting out from this fountain. And poet compares these flying rocks with two different images of hails and chaffy grains. Okay, then he says that in the middle of these dancing rocks the sacred river Elf was also flowing. Okay, here he says amid these dancing rocks at once and ever it flung up momentarily the sacred river. In the middle of these dancing rocks the sacred river Elf was also flowing. 5 miles meandering with a mazy motion. He says that this sacred river Elf flowed in a path that was meandering. Meandering means zigzag or winding. So it was the sacred river Elf followed a path of 5 miles in a meandering and winding motion, and this elf was flowing through wood and dale, the sacred river Rhine. And this river elf was flowing through wood. Wood means forests and dale means valleys or ghati. Wood means jungle and dale means ghati. Okay, then this elf was flowing through wood and dale, and then it reached the caverns measureless to man. Then it reached the caves that were so deep that man could not measure them, and finally sank in tumult to a lifeless ocean. And finally this river fell into a lifeless ocean. This roaring river fell into a lifeless or still ocean that was calm and motionless. That is why we are calling it lifeless. Okay. Amid this tumult, Kubla heard from far ancestral voices professing war. In the middle of this great roaring sound of the river Elf, Kubla Khan heard from far old or ancestral voices. Ancestral means Purvaj. He heard from his ancestors and they were professing war. These voices were professing war. Professing means bhavishyavani karna. Okay. The shadow of the dome of pleasure floated midway on the waves, where was heard the mingled measure from the fountain and the caves. So this pleasure dome or this pleasure palace was situated in midway between that mighty fountain and the measureless caves. Okay, because its shadows were falling on midway between the fountain and the caves, and from here you could easily hear sound of the water coming from both fountain and caves. So this palace was situated in midway between mighty fountain and caves. It was a miracle of rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. This palace was a miracle of rare device. That means too many skills were used in making this beautiful palace, because it had sunny domes along with caves of ice. Now, next he says, this is the second part of the poem. Okay, here the mood of the poem totally changes. A damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw. It was an Abyssinian maid, and on her dulcimer she played. Now in these lines, poet tells us about his strange vision or dream. And in his vision, he saw that a damsel means a maiden or a girl, who was playing a dulcimer. Dulcimer, you can see dulcimer on your screen right now. Okay, so she was playing a dulcimer, and this girl was an Abyssinian girl. Abyssinian maid, that means she belonged to Abyssinia. She was an Abyssinian girl, and she was playing a dulcimer, and she was singing of Mount Abora. She was playing on dulcimer and she was singing about Mount Abora. Could I revive within me her symphony and song? To such a deep delight it would win me, that with music loud and long I would build that dome in air. Now poet says that he does not remember the music and song of that girl, but he wishes to revive or recapture that beautiful music and song of that Abyssinian girl, because it was so nice that poet will feel inspired after listening to that particular music and song. And by the inspiration of this loud and long music, poet would build that pleasure dome in the air. That means he will write a vivid description of that palace of Kubla Khan, and when people will read and hear about it, they will be able to imagine that palace in front of them. Okay, because such vivid description of that palace will allow the reader to imagine that place very clearly. That sunny dome, those caves of eyes, and all who heard should see them there. Persons who heard this description of the palace of Kubla Khan, they would be able to see in the air that sunny dome and those caves of eyes. That means they would be able to imagine that very clearly. Okay, and all should cry, beware, beware, his flashing eyes, his floating hair. Weave a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes with holy dread, for he on honeydew hath fed, and drank the milk of paradise. Now he says that people, poet says that people would think that this poet is a magician, okay, who has flashing eyes. Flashing means shining eyes and floating hairs, and they would cry, beware, beware, out of fear from him. Beware means savdhan. Okay, they would go round him 3 times, and they would close their eyes with holy dread. Dread means fear. They would close their eyes with holy dread from that magician. Okay, because people would think that he is divinely inspired. That is why he has become a magician of words. And they would also think that he had drank some honeydew. Honeydew is a sweet substance from plants. They would think that he had drank honeydew, and he had also drank the milk of paradise. That means milk of paradise means nectar or amrit, you can say. That is why he had inspired divinely. Okay, so here ends the poem, and Coleridge begins with the description of the pleasure dome and its surroundings, and he also tells us that there is a sacred river called Elf, which flowing through the caves, and then there is gardens and aromatic plants and forests, etc. And there is a mysterious chasm also, and in this chasm a mighty fountain is bursting out, and this fountain is throwing some big fragments of the rocks, and these rocks look like hail that are rebounding. And he also compare these rocks with chaffy grains. Okay, and in second part of the poem, poet tells us that this palace was a great example of architectural skills because it had sunny domes and eyes of caves all together. And then he talks about his vision about that Abyssinian girl and her songs, and he wants to recapture that song because it will inspire him to write a vivid description of that palace. And in the end he says that he will be able to inspire divinely. Then if he will be able to inspire, he will then people will think of him, people will think about him that he is a great magician of words. So that is all for today's lecture. Thank you.